Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by, I think, our first third-time visitor, Dr. Joyce Maguire Pavao. Looking forward to our conversation today, Joyce.
Me too, but I always do, Simon. We have great conversations.
We do. We love it. We love it. So we're going to be talking a little bit about advocacy, or a lot about advocacy, on the back of the panel that we ran last month that Joyce was on and added, as I knew she was going to do, massive value to that. And I think there's also want to kind of explore the links between healing, for want of a better word, and advocacy. And I just wanted to, I say healing for want of a better word, because I was talking to Jude, fellow adoptee who I'm doing some work with, and we were talking about narratives. And the word healing, it's based on it presupposes it necessitates the fact that there has been a wound, right? Mm-hmm. And the obviously the primal wound, that phrase was coined by Nancy Verrier in the 90s, and she was an adoptive mum, or she is an adoptive mum, and there's a sense among some adoptees that it's a third party view, it's a third party narrative. It's not that the word wound is an adoptive parent's narrative, or summation of our trauma. And is it valid? Is it time for us to, what metaphor are we living our life by? Do we want to live our life by a wound and therefore the need to heal, or do we want to live our own narrative? And I just wanted to start off with that and get your take on this.
Well, absolutely. I think using the word narrative and using it to apply to our story is extremely important. And how we tell the story to ourselves and how we tell the story to others makes a huge difference in how we build our self-esteem and our view of ourselves and our identity. I think that you're absolutely right. The word healing, it's a pathology based, although it's good, it's about getting better, quote unquote. It is pathology based. And one of my advocacies in life has, in the mental health field, been not to pathologize adoptees, because most of the things that we're accusing them of having, most of the labels, most of the diagnoses are not indigenous to them. They're indigenous to the fact of adoption. So not all of them. Some things are definitely, there. Some things are definitely part of who the actual person is. But a lot of it is part of the narrative of adoption and what that has done in the process of building this person. So I think it might be helpful for us to learn new language, as you suggest, and to think about this as integrating. The narrative gives us a new identity and asks us to play a different role. And in the process of growing and changing, we look back and learn something about our original identity. And the work then is integrating all of the stories, all of the narratives of our life, and finding out who that makes us. there's a sadness and a loss in that you can't go back and be who you might have been, but you can certainly find the traits, the important pieces, the facts, the story of that person, of who you would have been, of where you came from, and integrate that into who you are, who you've become, and who you want to be. So I think, I used to do a lot of narrative therapy. There was, I'm getting so old I forget names, but there was a gentleman from New Zealand, David White, I think his name was, who did a lot of interesting work around family therapy. And I forget, I'll be happy to send you this afterwards, Simon. But narrative therapy really works with adoptees. Also at Harvard, I studied with Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, who was a professor there, who was very interested in, there's a couple of books that she's written on portraiture, sort of a psychological narrative portrait of a person and how that stays with them, and how it can change over time.
Yeah.
The narrative therapist that I mentioned, I think David White, one of my favorite quotes of his is that narrative therapy rescues the telling from the told. And I love that, because what it means is when you're told something, it's written in stone. This is your story. This is who you are. And it's told, it's done. There's no feeling that you can work on it, because it's just a matter of fact. And what narrative therapy does, it pulls you out of that, and it shows you that the telling of the story can change over time. It doesn't mean the facts change, but your view of the facts change. If you're coming immediately out of a trauma, you have certain feelings, visions about that are very set. As you grow and change, and if you want to use the word heal, in the process of working on that trauma, one of the things that helps you most is to begin to change the story, not to change the facts. You were traumatized, someone hurt you. We're not trying to fluff that up or make them feel better in any way. We're trying to have you see that you are not your trauma. You are more than your trauma. That's a part of you, but it's not the whole. So that's a very long answer. I'm so sorry.
No, there's so much, so many gems of wisdom in there. I remember you talking about the pathologization of adoptees on our first conversation, and that has stuck with me, but somehow means a lot more. You sharing that word again now. In fact, I'm getting goosebumps as I think about it. So that's huge. And it makes perfect sense when I realize why I'm having a physical reaction to it, because I think the primal wound is a pathologization. It is that, and it felt like that to me when I read the book 10, 12 years ago, and I thought I was stuck with it. I love your point about separating the telling from the told, and as you were quoting that David White chap, the view I was taking on it is it's separating the telling, which is the narrative, from the person who is told. So it's separating us from our story, and that is huge. When for many years we might have been telling ourselves that there's something wrong with us.
Mm-hmm.
We feel that there's something wrong with us. We feel that there's something missing. And then we read the primal wound and it confirms, yes, there is something missing. And then and the next question is, how do we heal? If we, well, the next question, the next point I got to was, I'm stuck with this. I can't heal. That's where I was for a few days after reading it, and then something happened. I don't know, and I moved out of that, moved away from that place of hopelessness to a place of, okay, so how do I heal? And then I read the book, the second book, Nancy's second book, Coming Home to Self, and it was far too complex and totally psychological. And as we know, healing, for want of a better word, is a holistic thing. It's not just about our psychology. It's not even just about our psychology and our emotions. It's bigger. It's bigger than that. So, we it's the somatic stuff as well. Obviously, Bessel van der Kolk and His Body Keeps the Score. We're looking at the physical reactions, the trauma that's stored in the body. And the other side, another way of looking at this is the internal family systems model, which of Richard Schwartz, which is it's looking at our parts, but it's also looking at the uppercase S, self, which is more of a spiritual take. So he's got a spiritual, not religious, a spiritual and a psychological thing. And we, as I explore this healing framework and get feedback from yourself and lots of other fantastic adoptees and funnel that all in, we're looking at a holistic thing here. We're looking at a holistic healing or a holistic integration, if we were going to coin your word. And integration, that metaphor of integration is about stories, but it's also about that also works for me with that parts model, because as Dick Schwartz says, the name of the book title is No Bad Parts. So we are not, as he would say, we're not kind of pushing away the exiled, we're not exiling the shamed, the shamed little confused adoptee that can't, wants to know where his birth parents have gone, or wants to know where her birth mother has gone, whatever it is. We're integrating everybody together. We're not rejecting any of the parts, because those parts have kept us safe.
Absolutely. I also think it's important to figure out which parts are oneself, small s, and which parts are, imposed upon us. I don't know if you've spoken yet with Sue Harris O'Connor.
I have spoken with her, but I haven't done the podcast with her yet.
She did a wonderful model that's really based on race and the perception of race. She, as a transracial adoptee, felt that was an important piece. But there are 5 different stages or ways of looking at oneself. And I'm not going to go into it. It's spectacular, and people should read it. But it also applies to adoptees who are in-race adoptees in some ways, because really there are these different parts of self, and some of them are imposed. Some of them are not indigenous. They're not growth parts. They're They're sort of, as you described, the primal wound, that's more of an imposed view of what's wrong with the situation. And frankly, most people want to know what's wrong because they don't feel that if they don't have a diagnosis, they don't think they can have a cure. The problem is if you get the wrong diagnosis, you can't treat it properly. And the diagnosis often isn't that of the adoptee, it's that of the system. And I think that birth and adoptive parents and professionals often get frightened by that because they feel it's accusatory, that you're saying something's wrong with them. And I don't believe there are certainly cases where there's something very wrong with certain people in certain situations, but in general, I see this as a very systemic problem. And it's very important. One of the pieces of healing is growing. And in developmental psychology, when you reach adolescence, early adulthood, you're supposed to be in a stage of individuation. Individuation is very hard for adoptees because they already lost one family, at least, maybe many. And now they're being moved away from this family. Now they can either do that by acting out and completely negating all of that, sometimes for very good reason and sometimes self-sabotaging. And I think that individuation piece is one of the integration pieces that we need to focus on, because that's where the adoptee now has the ability to do reflective thinking, to see themselves and to choose themselves, to look at their parts and to see which ones are theirs and which ones are not theirs. They just got stuck there. They're not attached. They're just lying on you. And how do we manage that and grow into ourselves? And some people can do that pretty well, and some people it takes years. And some people, it takes a catalyst of some sort. But it's, there's a lot that I think we can learn if we pay attention.
Yeah, looking at this holistic approach to healing circles. One of the outer layer of that, as I've developed it so far, is the cultural piece, and the cultural piece for a transracial adoptee or an internationally adopted adopted person is that displacement and the clash between the culture of the place that they where they were born and the culture of the place that they're being brought up in. That could also be the culture might be a difference between different cultures with that are to do with different races as well, and also the culture for us, for me, when I'm talking about transracial adoptee, our culture of white privilege in the UK and the US, and also that cultural piece that you're talking about in terms of the what's wrong in the system and also what's incorrect in the system and what's incorrect in the culture, and that piece around, how should we put it, the fairy tale view, the rainbow and unicorns view of adoption, and that's part of our healing too, is looking at that the culture in which we have been brought up, and those non-indigenous parts perhaps that you're alluding to of us, and that perhaps that leads us into the next the other phase of the conversation today in terms of advocacy. Sorry,
one thing, Simon, just one little tiny thing, and then I'm thinking about culture, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, writing about it, etc. And it is absolutely imperative that we pay attention to the vast differences in culture in terms of transracial and international adoption. Absolutely. But I think every family has a culture. And when I'm doing family therapy, I spend a lot of time looking at the cultures of the grandparents and the parents who are raising this child, because the parents, for instance, come from two very different cultures, maybe different religions, maybe different, starkly different cultures, but maybe they're both, you know, from the same ethnic background, maybe they're from the same religious background, but their families had family culture, the way they did things and what they believed in, and how that was infused into each parent, and how that plays out in their relationship impacts. There's so many different cultural issues impacting this child. And I think it's very important that sometimes we look at the minutia and we really see what the little details are, what the messages are that are coming. I just worked with an adoptee whose adoptive parents, the father has no connection to his family and never did. He left to go into the army or something when he was 18, and he never reconnected with his family. Doesn't say a lot about why, just isn't very connected. And believe me, I've tried to get him to talk about it. The mother is enmeshed with her family. She is overly connected to her family. And he doesn't mind that because he has no family, so he goes with the flow. Now they have this child who is married and had their first child and doesn't want the enmeshment and doesn't want the alienation, wants to create some new kind of relationships. And it's not going well. This is adoption, but this goes on in all families. And I think it's important to acknowledge it, because the impact of that, especially on the adoptee who's already struggling with who am I? Where do I come from? Where did this come from? Where, it's huge.
Yeah.
So I won't take any more time
No,
because I
no.
know you.
I think as you were talking about the difference between the mothers and the fathers' families, I was thinking about my own mum and dad. And so my dad was an only child. My mum's the eldest of four. They had very different, the cultures of the families were very different. One was, both stay at home mums, but one was one was like part of a family business, and one was a manager in somebody else's business, and they had completely different views of life and different takes on family. So, and people get stuck between the two, as they say. So the question, kind of the next question I had for you really was, how do you see we're going to use healing, but we could also use the word integration. How do you see healing or integration and advocacy? Where do you see the links between these two?
Well, for years and years and years, when working with adoptees, when working with all people involved in adoption and people in general, I think that one of the ways to get to a place of integration, of insight, is to look outside. And so I think that, especially in the case of rage and anger, which is very appropriate in many instances, but there's an arc to where it needs to be and where it needs to flow in order for one to not get stuck in it and hurt by it. So my work with people has been to help them to see where to project that anger And one of the best ways I can think of is advocacy. If you're fighting for something, if you're, fighting for injustice and you feel very strongly about this, you are going to make an impact on others and on yourself, and you're not going to necessarily hurt yourself or others in the way that you might if you choose to just aim that at an individual. Sometimes, and this isn't always true at all, but it's something that's true. So there's a quote by Pablo Picasso that I like. The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. So I think if you can find the things you care about, the things you want to change, the things that you're passionate about, and you can really find those, that's the first step. And the second step is to give them away, to do it through teaching, through advocacy, through, being a therapist, or being a nurse, being a lawyer, advocating for the rights of the people that you identify with and feel aren't being cared for in the proper ways.
It's really profound, that, and kind of I think if I was to hear that, I could perhaps underestimate the profundity of what you just said, because as I see the profundity from it's not about me anymore. It's about we. It's about us. So we are connecting with a force bigger than us. We're connecting with a group of people bigger than us, and it's no longer poor little me. It's like I'm shifting the focus on. Who was it? This was an American. Was this JFK said, "Don't ask what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Was that?
Yeah.
JFK, yeah. Something like that. So it takes. It gives us an expanded. It gives us an expanded vision. And it kind of lifts. It's lifting us up, and it's taking us place. It's I'm going to ask you about the arc that you talked about and mentioned, but it's kind of it's like somebody's pushed a button on our empowerment, a button called empowerment, or perhaps I'm trying to think of something from the Matrix. You're taking the blue pill from the Matrix. You're actually opening a bigger perspective. So are we connecting with a bigger group of people than ourselves? It's no longer about us. It's about somebody else. And will we do more? We'll do more for other people than we'll do for ourselves, won't we?
I think it's about us. I mean, we can't not have it be about us, but it's also it does expand the vision. In many cultures, there is no I. There is definitely we, and that's how people talk about themselves. It's in our culture in this day and age that's very independent. And and the goal in life is to be independent in every way, and to be, strong and powerful as an independent being. And the reality is, human beings are not independent, they're interdependent. You can tell by an infant. I mean, the failure to thrive is because there's not that interdependency. It has to be there. And the reason why some children were raised by people other than the parents who gave birth to them in many cultures and in many times, when it wasn't a system of adoption, it was just the way things were done. It was done to protect that child, because if the birth mother died or didn't have any milk or something, someone else had to step in, and that was we. and the we would help to raise the child. And there was no secrecy, there were no changes of labels, there were changes of roles. And I think that we're not going to change the fact that some people for the rest of time will not be raised by the people who gave birth to them. But that does not mean we need to make it into an industry and change names and make falsified documents and lies and secrets. We can do it and have it be completely appropriate. It's how we take care of our own. And our own becomes larger the more we expand and the more we include other people.
Yeah. You mentioned the. So I was going to ask you about the arc. You mentioned an arc. Can you explain what the arc is about?
Well, arcs. I once had I've had many names of things that I've started in my advocacy work. An arc, the adoption resource, small RE, large source, was center was one of the places that I had in the 1970s. And I did a summer intensive training course called archaeology. And I really believe there are arcs. Things go certain ways, but the problem is if they stay stuck at some level of that arc, they're not going through the process that needs to happen. And I was talking about that in terms of anger. I think anger is very productive, very important, very real. But if you get stuck in anger and that's what you become, if that part of you is what shows up only and always, it's not in your best interest. And it's not any kind of stuck place that isn't flowing is holding you back from the integration and the growth that you need.
Yeah. I'm just clicking around on my computer because I found a quote. I found a quote this week which I kind of think is a lovely counterpoint to that anger point. So if I just see if I can find it on my computer. Oh yeah, okay. So this is a Mark Twain quote, and it's forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. And I just thought that that's a beautiful counterpoint to anger. And I think of my own anger with stuff and how my own anger with stuff, it's me that's suffering.
Mm-hmm. But you can't, it's not, the problem is people want a pill. They want something to fix things right away. And every human being has a different pacing and a different way of going about things. What I see in therapy with people is it's important to be with them while they're going through that, but it's also important to let them know that, is this really where you want to live? Do you want to live in anger? Or would you like to visit it on occasion when it comes up? How do you see yourself in this situation? What's going to be most beneficial for you?
Yeah. Is the integration then the integration of anger then, for example, does that mean, or the integration of the angry part means bringing that part in rather than pushing it away? I'm trying to, what does integration, what does integration, what does your take on integration, what has that got to do with anger? How do those two things fit together?
Well, I mean, I was speaking much more generally using the word integration, but you could use it in a smaller way. And I think, in order to go through something, you have to accept it. So, of course, pushing things away or diminishing them, which often adoptees are taught to do, really doesn't help you to get through it. You need to confront it. And anger is an interesting emotion because, as you know, it doesn't stand alone. It's usually covering sadness or guilt or shame. If you dig deep enough in anger, it's a cover. And it underneath that is what you need to get to integrate yourself or to heal yourself. So it has triggered something in you that causes that anger, which is a protective mechanism to keep you from. I've had so many clients say, I don't want to be sad because I'll never stop crying. I could see myself just crying for the rest of my life, and I would rather be angry. Well, there's a stage where that's important, but there's also a stage where you can slowly examine the sadness and figure out what it's about and think about what you can do for it and think about who you can advocate for that might experience something similar, that might give you strength and might change the way you feel about yourself and about others.
Yeah. Again, I'm getting the feeling that you've shared that with me before. The anger hides shame. Is that sum up what you were saying? It's
yeah.
And so you're lifting the bonnet or lifting the hood, I think you'd say in the States. You're lifting the hood on the anger and you're finding the shame or the fear underneath that. That's the cause. That's the hidden bit. That's the hidden bit, the bit that's hidden under the stone. The other thing about anger and advocacy, they're not really good bedfellows, are they? So maybe perhaps that's the wrong expression, but
they're good to, like, the anger can motivate you, but if you present only with the anger, you're going to turn people off and you're not going to get the result that you want. So it's important to figure out what your goal is. And I was watching a newscast the other day. There are tons of sit-ins in tent cities at all the universities here around the pro-Palestine situation. And I don't want to get into politics. We're already talking about deep enough subjects. But what I did want to say is there was a young woman who was the spokesperson that was being interviewed. And she was very angry, rightly so. Her family, many of her family had died. And but she was screeching and she was so angry and so screechy that you couldn't really hear her heart. You could see her pain and her anger, but I think to advocate, you need something that's going to get the attention and draw people in, not push them away. So the first thing is to use your anger or any of your feelings or any of the things you need to heal the trauma. The first thing is to figure out what you can do with that to help others. And in fact, that will help yourself. The next step is to figure out how to do that and how to do it effectively, because you don't want to go into something and not be able to empower people and to make the change. Now you're going to have not everyone's going to like you at all in any. I mean, you know, you're definitely going to get vilified by certain people, even if you do it the best possible way. So you also have to develop a bit of a thick skin so that you can walk right past all of that negativity and keep in mind what your goal is and why you're doing it. And figure out how to make that happen so that you can make change.
Yeah. I think the first thing I heard about advocacy from a fellow adoptee was adoptee from the UK, transracial adoptee, and she was saying that if it's perfectly okay. This is in the UK, right? In London specifically, it's perfectly okay for politicians to get angry in amongst themselves, right? But if you're a non-politician, if you're an advocate, and you're going into their space, the space of politics, and you present, to use your word of present, and you present any anger, then you get cancelled. So I love the distinction that you drew between using your anger to propel yourself forward, and focusing on what it is that you want to achieve, what your goal is, because and focusing on how you best to achieve that goal. Because if you are presenting anger, then it's unlikely, in London anyway, in those circles, that people will listen to you. So it's a self-defeating emotion. Whilst in those circles, we have to be able to, I don't know, whatever it is, remain calm as best we can, I guess.
I think, well, I don't think you need to remain calm, but need to remain aware of what your goal is, what you're doing, and how egocentric the people you're presenting are. So what are they going to get out of it? What are you going, I mean, they need to get something to even listen to you. So it's important to figure all of that out. There's a huge amount of strategy in advocating that, and I have to say, most of us adoptees have been propelled by very strong feelings and weren't always thinking about what we were doing. Even in the case of, when I'm working with an adoptee who's searching for their birth mother, for instance, and they're about to figure out how they're going to approach their birth mother. I've had adoptees go to the door and ring the doorbell. That is such not a good idea when you pull back and think about it. Really, you're prepared to do this, but that person isn't prepared to receive you. What is your goal? Is your goal to lay eyes on that person once in your life? Then you might ring the doorbell and see them, and that's it. But the chances are pretty good they're not going to want to talk to you at that moment, in that shock, in that situation. So how do you help people to really carefully think about what is your goal and how are you going to get there? How are you going to make that happen? Because the success of that is what's going to feed you. It's going to really, it's a reciprocal situation. And if you just stomp around and scream about what you hate, there are some people who are going to join you and stomp with you. But are you going to have any effect? Are you going to make change? Are you going to advocate for a simple situation that you want to see done differently? I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. So let's figure out what is going to work. So there are stages, and those stages, they look a certain way, but under those stages is a lot of therapy that's going on without even calling it that. Because you're having to slow down, you're having to look at yourself, you're having to, use all the organic things, the meditation, the thoughtfulness, the mindfulness, the awareness of what's going on in your body. How are you feeling? How is this feeling going to be translated into something that will really work for you and for others?
Yeah. I wish I'd had this conversation last September, because I rang my birth father completely out of the blue, and at 58 years, and I didn't have a good reception. So maybe I should have been a bit more intentional about it. That was the word that was coming to my mind to kind of sum up where you were being about being intentional. There was another comment on Facebook regarding the post of the advocacy panel and the replay of that, and it was something about an adoptee being petrified of rejection. So the sense that I got is that adoptee couldn't advocate, couldn't advocate because of a fear of rejection, not being listened to, or something holding that person back. What would you say to that?
Well, it's, I'm going to say something, but it's not really fair, because I would need to know them and to know how fragile they were or what was going on. I wouldn't just, but in service of this conversation, I'll tell you what I think. Petrified's a great word, because, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And the frozen person is the petrified person. So this person is frozen and unable to move. And the fear of being rejected is that worse than the fear of having been rejected, which is how he or she may think about themselves for having been in the situation of adoption. And is that worse than the current situation? Is that worse than not knowing? Are there things you could get from this that aren't just acceptance or rejection? That is there information that you need and that you want and that you deserve? How can you look at this differently? And how can you feel comfortable that you're not going to lose yourself in the process of having someone decide to like you or not like you?
Yeah. So perhaps a dialogue to have, rather than something on your own, thing on your own. I'm as I say that, I'm thinking about your comment about this being unfair. I'm also thinking about how people react on social media, and it's perhaps a tricky one.
It is. Well, you'll get people who will think our conversation is useful and interesting. You'll get people who think it's bullshit. You'll get people who, that's okay. People are at different stages and different pacing, and they have different experiences, and they're seeing this in different ways. And all of those ways, it's what we call multiple realities. We think we're saying something, and that's what we're saying. That's not what everyone's hearing. They're hearing, even as you heard some of what I said, and then you filtered it through your own experience to make sense of it and to talk about it further. That's a very common way of processing. But everyone has different ways of processing. So it's, you can't do anything about that. You can't really, you can only keep moving, know that what you're saying and doing is for the good of people, you're working for good, not evil. And that's your intention. Then how people take that is really nothing you have any control over.
Yeah. I was we've quoted JFK. I was going to quote Churchill. I think he said something like, "My reputation is not my business."
Exactly.
Something like that.
Speaking of which, have you interviewed his granddaughter who was adopted?
No.
Oh, I'm going to send you her. Interesting story.
Wow.
Yeah, very interesting.
So what else what else is there in this well, what else is there on this healing arc or healing journey and advocacy? What other cross links do you see between these two things? Because they seem different, don't they? But they are
I think
intrinsically
they're
different.
different, but they intersect. And
They
I think,
intersect.
it's, it's just important to, this is all bringing things to awareness, and then what people do with them or how they process them, as I said, is really their own thing. I think that we had a very good conversation, but I don't think that we talked enough about the nuts and bolts of advocacy. So sometime way later, when you feel like it, let's go through some of that. Just let's see what people think about this, and let's go through some of that and look at the developmental issues in advocacy, because you start advocating at birth. You advocate for your food. It's time to eat. It's time to, you learn to advocate very early on.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was thinking about how if I wanted something, I'd ask my mum and she'd say no, and then I'd go and ask my dad the same thing.
Yeah.
So this is trying to get what we want from an early stage. Yeah. So the way we've got some more advocacy panels coming up, and we're looking at different areas. And I see it as a theme to bring more people together. So we will maybe the one that we do in June, July will be more about nuts and bolts. And I think the other one that we're looking at doing is the legislation stuff. So advocating for young adoptees, then one for adoptive parents on advocating for your adopted child or children, and then some legislation and maybe some nuts and bolts stuff as well. Can you give us, because you talked about before we hit the record button, you talked about the changing advocacy over our lifetime. Is that something that needs a bigger space? Because we've been on for about 3/4 of an hour or so now. Does it need more space for it? Have we reached a natural end for the conversation today? Or
I think I do need to end our conversation now, but think about a time when you want to plug in some more discussion about the details of what goes on in a life, and how it can really give you some markers to figure out what you're doing. I don't think people give themselves credit for advocating sometimes, when what they're doing is advocating.
yeah,
And when we started talking, Simon, you mentioned that you had just gotten off the phone with a group from another country, and that they were interested in having you work with them. And you might have thought, oh, that's great. I'll go do some teaching. I'll go do a talk. And you're doing that, but you're also advocating. The way you have filled yourself with different views from so many different adoptees. You've done an amazing job of interviewing people over the years and really figuring out things and agreeing or disagreeing and putting things together. You have a great overview, and sharing that with people is advocacy.
yeah. Thank you. And that is, when you were talking about the gift, learn your stuff and then give it away. That's what I'm trying to do.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Joyce. So listeners are going to put some links in the show notes to the previous episodes that Joyce has been on. So you can, especially, I think the one about pathologizing adoption, I think that's particularly significant to me. And we'll also put a link to the advocacy panel that Joyce added so much to last time, and Susan Harris O'Connor, who was introduced to me by Joyce as well. So we've got a lot to thank Joyce for in this area. So thank you very much, Joyce, and
You're very welcome.
very soon.
Have a beautiful sunny day.
You too. Thanks a lot, Joyce. Thanks, listeners. We'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Take care.